Elena Rossi sat on a small wooden chair in the warm kitchen of her family's home, her tiny hands clutching a mug of warm milk her mother had just prepared. Outside, the winter wind of 1972 swept through San Martino, a small town nestled among olive groves and stony hills in northern Italy. The church bells rang from the ancient steeple, steady as the town's heartbeat, calling everyone to evening prayers. The scent of baking bread mingled with the aroma of burning wood in the fireplace, painting a picture of peace that Elena, at 8 years old, knew as well as her own breath. Her mother, Signora Maria, stood by the stove, a floral apron tied tightly around her waist, kneading dough while humming a gentle hymn. Her voice was soft, not as resonant as the church choir, but enough to make Elena feel safe. Her father, Signore Antonio, sat across from her, his rough farmer's hands flipping through the local newspaper. He spoke little, but each word carried the weight of the stones on San Martino's hills. "Elena, have you finished learning your prayers?" Signora Maria asked, not looking up from the dough. "Yes, Mama," Elena replied, her voice clear and bright. "I've memorized the Hail Mary and the Our Father. Father Giuseppe said I recited them well." Signore Antonio nodded, a rare smile flickering across his weathered face. "Good. God likes obedient children. You must stay devout, Elena. That's how we get to heaven." Elena nodded, though in her young heart, those words weren't entirely clear. She'd grown up in the Catholic embrace of San Martino, the gray stone church with its statues of the Virgin Mary and Jesus, the long masses with the scent of incense, and Father Giuseppe's stern teachings about sin and salvation. She knew to pray to keep her heart pure, to do good deeds to please God. But sometimes she wondered if God truly noticed a little girl like her among the thousands in this town. That night, as the family knelt by the small altar in the living room, a wooden cross on the wall and a tiny Virgin Mary statue on the shelf, Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't tell anyone, but for days she'd felt more tired than usual. Her legs grew heavy when she ran through the olive groves with her brother Luca, and sometimes she had to stop to catch her breath. She thought it was just the winter cold, but as she bowed her head in prayer, a strange heat stirred in her chest, as if something was quietly shifting. After prayers, Elena climbed into bed, pulling the thick wool blanket up to her chin. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden window, making her shiver, but the glow of the oil lamp her mother left on the table comforted her. She whispered her final prayer. "Dear God, please keep me and my family safe." Then she closed her eyes, unaware that this night would mark the beginning of a journey beyond anything she could imagine. 3 days later, Elena no longer sat in the kitchen with her warm milk. She lay in bed, blankets piled up to her neck, her eyes shut tight as a fever consumed her small body. The room no longer smelled of bread, but was filled with her labored breathing and Signora Maria's desperate prayers. The oil lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, like spirits dancing in silence. Signora Maria knelt beside the bed, her trembling hands clutching a rosary. "Holy Virgin Mary, save my daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking. She wiped Elena's forehead with a damp cloth, but sweat kept pouring out, so hot it made her flinch. Signore Antonio stood in the corner, his eyes red but his face set in stubborn resolve. He'd walked 5 kilometers to the village doctor, only to return with grim news. "He says it's typhoid fever. We need to get her to a hospital in Florence, but the roads are iced over." Luca, Elena's 12-year-old brother, sat curled up on a chair, clutching the small guitar he often played to lull her to sleep. He didn't strum it today, just stared at his sister with wide, fearful eyes. "Will Elena be okay, Mama?" he asked, his voice trembling. Signora Maria didn't answer, only continued praying. She couldn't tell Luca that her heart was shattering, that each weak breath from Elena cut into her like a knife. Signore Antonio stepped over, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "God will decide, Luca. We can only pray." Father Giuseppe arrived in the afternoon, bringing holy oil and a thick Bible. He anointed Elena's forehead, reciting Latin prayers the family barely understood but trusted as their link to God. "Have faith in His will," he said before leaving, but his voice was heavy, as if he doubted a miracle would come. That night, Elena's fever peaked. She no longer recognized her mother's voice or felt the cool cloth on her skin. Her body burned, her chest aching with every breath. In her delirium, she saw strange images, olive groves covered in snow, church bells ringing far away, and a faint light at the end of the village road. She wanted to run toward it, but her legs wouldn't move. Signora Maria held her daughter's hand, tears falling onto Elena's frail fingers. "Elena, my love, don't leave me," she sobbed. Signore Antonio turned away, hiding his tears, but his shoulders shook. Luca stood, set the guitar down, and ran outside, unable to bear the scene. As the clock struck midnight, Elena felt a shift. The pain faded, as if someone were gently peeling away layers of burden. Her mother's prayers grew distant, the lamplight dimmed, and she felt herself floating, no longer on the bed but suspended in a strange space. She opened her eyes, or rather, her consciousness awoke, and saw herself lying motionless below, surrounded by her weeping family. Elena no longer felt her body. She hovered above the ceiling, looking down at the scene below like a spectator in her own life's drama. Signora Maria clung to her small, still form, whispering prayers that no longer reached her ears. Signore Antonio stood frozen, gripping the cross on the wall, his lips moving in silent pleas. Luca had returned, standing at the threshold, his red-rimmed eyes fixed on his sister he couldn't save. She wanted to scream, "I'm still here. I haven't left." But no sound came. She reached out, or thought she did, but there was nothing. No hands, no feet, just a consciousness adrift in the cold space. The helplessness terrified her, yet a strange peace crept into her heart, as if an unseen hand were holding her up. Then it appeared. A small light in the corner of the room, faint like a candle about to gutter out in the wind. But it didn't fade, it grew, spreading into a warm, gentle glow, like spring sunlight filtering through olive leaves. It wasn't blinding or harsh, but inviting, carrying a warmth she'd never known. It wasn't like the lamplight or the sun. It felt alive, pulsing with love. Elena looked back at her family once more. She saw her mother's tears fall onto her lifeless cheeks, her father's clenched fists as if holding her back, Luca trembling in the corner. She wanted to stay for them, for their love had been her entire world. But the light pulled her, not with force but with a promise of peace beyond all pain. "Do I have to go?" she wondered, not aloud, just a thought in her young mind. The light didn't answer with words, but she felt a gentle sensation, like her mother's embrace on cold winter days. "You're safe," it seemed to whisper, and she couldn't resist. As she let herself drift toward the light, the room below faded. Her mother's sobs, her father's murmurs, the wind whistling through the window, all grew distant like a memory from long ago. The light enveloped her, warm and complete, washing away every ache, every fear. She felt she was no longer the sick little girl, but part of something vast, a place where love was everything. Then from within the light a figure emerged. It was a woman, cloaked in a soft blue robe like the San Martino sky in spring, her face kind yet radiant. Elena knew her instantly, the Virgin Mary, similar yet different from the statue in the church. Not cold wood or plaster, but a living presence, her deep eyes gazing at Elena with boundless love. "Elena," the Virgin said, her voice gentle as water flowing through the village stream. "You've been so strong. Don't be afraid." "You're not alone." Elena stood, or rather floated, before the Virgin Mary, feeling as if time had stopped. The space around her was no longer the small room in San Martino but a strange realm, boundless, with no walls or floor, only the gentle light surrounding her. The Virgin smiled, and that smile melted every worry in the 8-year-old's heart. "Where am I, Holy Mother?" Elena asked, her voice small but clear in the stillness. "You're in a place where God's love touches you," the Virgin replied, her voice like a soothing hymn. "You've suffered much, Elena, but now it's time for you to see the truth." "What truth?" Elena tilted her head, her eyes wide. She remembered Father Giuseppe's teachings, that God judged sins, that she had to live well to reach heaven. But here she felt no judgment, only overwhelming love. The Virgin raised her hand, and before Elena's eyes, images appeared like a wondrous film. She saw herself, running through the olive groves, kneeling in prayer with her mother, sneaking fallen olives to eat despite her father's warnings. She saw moments of fear, when she broke her mother's vase and lied, when she envied Luca for getting more praise. But the Virgin didn't scold. She simply looked at Elena with tender eyes. "You think God wants you to be perfect," the Virgin said. "But He doesn't demand that. He wants your heart, Elena. The grace of my son Jesus is a gift for you, not a reward you must earn. Elena frowned. But Father Giuseppe said I have to do good deeds and avoid sin. Otherwise, I won't go to heaven. The Virgin shook her head gently, a loving gesture. Good deeds are the fruit of love, not the key to heaven's gate. My son has already opened that gate with his love and sacrifice. You only need to trust and receive it. The images shifted. Elena saw a man in a white robe standing on a rocky hill. He was nailed to a cross, blood dripping from his hands and feet, yet his eyes shone with love. She recognized him, Jesus, like the painting in the church, but alive closer. Her heart ached, not from fear, but from a mix of sorrow and awe. Why did he do that? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Because he loves you, the Virgin answered. And because love is the only way to save the world. Elena didn't fully understand, but she felt the truth in those words. She'd thought God was a stern judge, but now she saw him as a father, a brother willing to die for her. The Virgin took her hand, a warm, real sensation, and led her deeper into the light. The light opened into a scene Elena had never dreamed of. She stood in a vast field of flowers, their colors shimmering under a gentle glow, as if each petal were woven from joy. Beyond, green hills stretched endlessly, and a song rose, not the church hymns but a natural deep melody, like wind blending with water. She felt light, free of pain and fear. Where is this? Elena asked, her eyes wide with wonder. This is heaven, the Virgin said, her voice filled with pride. Where God's love is complete, where every soul finds peace. Elena looked around and saw others, not strangers though she'd never met them. An elderly woman approached, her face radiant, her eyes twinkling as if she'd once told Elena stories. Nana, Elena whispered, recognizing her grandmother, who died when she was little. Nana hugged her, and the embrace was as warm as the days they'd baked together. You've grown so much, Nana smiled, stroking her hair. God is so good, isn't he? Elena nodded, tears of joy falling. She wanted to stay here where there was no suffering, where love was all. But then the Virgin raised her hand, and the scene changed. The flower field vanished, replaced by a desolate, dark land. The light was dim, the air heavy like thick fog on San Martino's hills in winter. Elena shivered, feeling cold though no wind blew. She saw shadowy figures, not smiling, not singing, just sitting in silence, their faces etched with sorrow and regret. What is this place? She asked, her voice trembling. This is where those who reject God's love go, the Virgin replied, her tone sad but not angry. God doesn't send them here, Elena. They choose to turn away from him, and this is the result, emptiness without love. Elena looked at those faces, her heart heavy. She saw a man, his eyes hollow, as if searching for something lost. She wanted to run to him to help, but the Virgin held her back. You can't change their choices, she said, but you can bring light to others. What light? Elena asked. The grace of my son, the Virgin answered. You've seen heaven and the dark hollow. What will you choose, Elena? To stay here, or to return and share this love? Elena gazed around, heaven's radiance, the hollow's chill, and her family in her memory. She thought of her mother, her father Luca, the church bells, and the smell of bread. I want to help others, she whispered. But I'm scared. The Virgin smiled, touching her forehead. Don't fear. I'll be with you, and my son will guide you. The light flared, and Elena felt herself pulled back, away from heaven, but carrying a small flame in her heart. When Elena opened her eyes, the gentle light of heaven was gone, replaced by the flickering glow of the oil lamp in the Rossi family's small room. Signora Maria's sobs filled her ears, no longer distant but close and heart-wrenching. She felt her mother's hand gripping hers, trembling fingers clinging as if afraid she'd vanish again. Signore Antonio knelt by the bed, his head bowed, his broad shoulders shaking. Luca stood in the corner, his red eyes wide, staring at his sister as if he couldn't believe what he saw. Elena? My love, can you hear me? Signora Maria whispered, her voice breaking with tears. Elena nodded weakly, her throat too dry to speak at first. She wanted to tell them everything, about the light, the Virgin, heaven and the hollow, but her body felt heavy, as if her soul hadn't fully returned to its fragile shell. She wiggled her fingers and Signora Maria burst into louder sobs. pulling her into a tight embrace. God heard us. Oh, Holy Virgin, thank you. Signore Antonio looked up, his stern face now alight with hope. He touched Elena's forehead, and for the first time in days he smiled. She's cool, he said, his voice trembling. The fever's gone. It's a miracle. Luca rushed over, nearly tumbling onto the bed, hugging his sister. You scared me to death, Elena. Don't ever do that again. He laughed, but tears still rolled down his cheeks. The room filled with a mix of laughter and crying. A tangle of emotions Elena felt even through her haze. The village doctor, Signore Bianchi, arrived soon after. He examined her with aged hands, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't understand, he said, peering through thick glasses. Yesterday I was sure she wouldn't make it. Now no trace of typhoid. It's as if it never happened. Signora Maria kissed Elena's forehead, whispering thanks to the Virgin. Signore Antonio stood, vowing to bring a large bouquet to the church in gratitude. But Elena, lying there in her family's arms, sensed something greater than their explanations. She knew this wasn't just a miracle. It was a gift from the Virgin and her son, a promise of a mission. In the days that followed, Elena recovered swiftly, astonishing San Martino. She no longer lay bedridden. She ate her mother's bread and even ran outside with Luca, though Signora Maria always shouted for her to slow down. But inside, Elena wasn't the carefree girl she'd been. When she closed her eyes, she saw that light, heard the Virgin's voice, and felt the small flame in her heart. A flame of grace she didn't yet know how to wield. One night, as her family slept, Elena sat by the window, gazing at the snow-dusted olive groves under the moonlight. She whispered, Holy Mother, what do I do now? I don't know where to start. There was no reply, but a wave of peace flooded her, as if the Virgin were there, listening. A week after her recovery, Elena returned to daily life in San Martino, but she no longer saw the world the same way. The church bells still rang each morning, but now they stirred in her not just routine but a deep question. What does God want from me? She attended Mass with her family on Sundays, sitting on the long wooden pews in the gray stone church, listening to Father Giuseppe preach about judgment and salvation. But those words now felt foreign. They didn't match what the Virgin had said, lacking the warmth of the light she'd seen. Signora Maria noticed the change in her daughter. You're too quiet, Elena, she said one afternoon as they kneaded dough in the kitchen. You're well now, why aren't you happy? I am well, Mama, Elena replied, but her eyes drifted, as if searching for something beyond reach. She couldn't tell her mother about heaven, the hollow, or the Virgin's call. How could Mama understand when Elena herself didn't fully grasp it? One day, when Luca took her to the church's small library to borrow books for school, Elena stumbled upon an old Bible on a high shelf. She pulled it down, dust coating its worn leather cover. She opened it secretly, reading lines from the Gospel of John. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. The words struck her like a blade. They echoed what the Virgin had shown her about love and grace, not rules or punishment. From then on, Elena read the Bible in secret whenever she could. She hid it under her pillow, opening it at night when the oil lamp burned low. Stories of Jesus, healing the blind, forgiving sinners, dying on the cross, brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't the stern God Father Giuseppe spoke of, but a God of love who'd opened heaven's door for her without demanding perfection. But this discovery brought fear. Elena knew her family, especially Signore Antonio, lived by San Martino's strict Catholic traditions. He believed faith meant obedience, attending Mass, confessing sins, doing good, and any deviation was sinful. If she said grace mattered more than rituals, would he call her a heretic? One night, as she read by the lamp, Luca entered the room unnoticed. What are you sneaking around for? He asked, curious. Elena jumped, hiding the Bible. Nothing, Luca. Just reading a story. He frowned but didn't press. You've been weird since you got better, Elena. If something's up, tell me, okay? She nodded but stayed silent. She wanted to trust Luca, her brother who always protected her, but feared he'd tell their parents, and everything would unravel. Elena's secrecy couldn't last forever. One winter afternoon, as snow fell lightly over the olive groves, she met Sofia Moretti, her childhood friend, by the village stream. Sofia, a blonde girl with bright eyes, was skipping stones across the icy water, creating ripples in the cold flow. "Elena!" Sophia exclaimed, spotting her. "You're all better. I heard your mama say you nearly died, but you don't look sick at all now." Elena smiled, sitting beside her friend. "I'm fine, Sophia. But I need to tell you something." Sophia tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "What's so serious? Did you find treasure in the groves?" Elena laughed softly, then grew solemn. She took a deep breath, the cold wind filling her lungs with courage. "Sophia, when I was sick, I left my body. I saw a light, met the Virgin, and she showed me heaven. She said Jesus loves me, that grace is everything, not rules." Sophia went quiet, her eyes widening. She didn't laugh or run away as Elena feared. Instead, she took Elena's hand, her voice soft but firm. "I believe you, Elena. I don't understand it all, but I know you wouldn't lie." "What else did she say?" Elena poured out everything about the light, Jesus on the cross, heaven and the hollow. Sophia listened, shivering occasionally from the wind, but never looking away. When Elena finished, Sophia whispered, "You're so lucky. I've never seen anything beyond the church and the groves. But if the Virgin said that, it must be true." Sophia's support felt like a warm breeze in winter. Elena's heart lightened. At least she wasn't alone. "But I'm scared, Sophia. If my parents find out, they'll think I'm crazy. Father Giuseppe will say I'm a heretic." Sophia shrugged. "Then don't tell them yet. Figure it out first. I heard there's a group in the next village who pray differently. They don't just recite, they live like Jesus taught. Want to try?" Elena nodded, though her heart pounded. She knew this was the first step to understanding the Virgin's mission, but also the first step away from her family's safe haven. A few days later, Elena and Sophia slipped out of San Martino, walking the snow-covered path to Santa Lucia, the neighboring village. Sophia led her to a small stone house where a group met every Wednesday night. It wasn't an official church, no steeple, no plaster statues, just a simple room with wooden chairs and a cross on the wall. As the girls entered, an elderly woman, Signora Teresa, greeted them with a warm smile. "You're Elena, aren't you?" she asked, her voice kind like Elena's nana. "I heard about your recovery. God is marvelous." Elena nodded, shyly taking a seat with Sophia. The group of about 10, old and young alike, wore no vestments or recited Latin like Father Giuseppe. Instead, they sang simple Italian hymns, shared stories of Jesus, and prayed from their hearts. A man, Signore Marco, spoke of being forgiven after a great mistake and finding peace in God's love. Elena listened, her heart racing. This was what she'd felt in the light, love and grace, not rules or judgment. When her turn came, Signora Teresa asked, "Do you want to share anything, Elena?" She took a deep breath and told her story, the light, the Virgin, the call. The room fell silent. Then Signora Teresa hugged her. "God chose you, little one. Don't be afraid. We're here to help you understand." In the following evenings, Elena snuck to Santa Lucia weekly, bringing the small Bible Sophia found for her. She learned to pray not just with memorized words, but with her heart, whispering to the Virgin and Jesus, asking for guidance. But she knew this secrecy couldn't last forever. One evening, returning late from Santa Lucia, Elena found Signore Antonio waiting in the kitchen. He sat at the table, hands clasped tightly, his face dark as a storm cloud. Signora Maria stood behind, her eyes anxious. "Where were you, Elena?" Signore Antonio asked, his voice low but sharp. Elena stood still, clutching her coat. "I went out with Sophia, Papa." "Don't lie," he snapped. "Luca saw you heading toward Santa Lucia. Were you with that heretic group?" Elena trembled but couldn't deny it. "They're not heretics, Papa. They believe in Jesus just differently. When I was sick, I saw the Virgin, and she told me to share grace, not live in fear." Signore Antonio slammed his hand on the table, rattling a water glass. "The Virgin doesn't say such things. You've been deceived, Elena. The Church is the only truth. Do you dare turn your back on our faith?" Signora Maria stepped forward, touching his arm. "Antonio, calm down. Elena's just a child. She doesn't mean harm." "No, Maria," he shouted. "She chose this path, she faces the consequences. If you don't apologize to Father Giuseppe and stop, you leave this house today." Elena stood frozen, tears streaming down. She looked at her father, the man who'd held her when she fell in the groves, taught her to pick olives with his rough hands. I can't apologize for the truth, Papa, she whispered. I love you, but I have to do what the Virgin asked. Signore Antonio turned away, storming out without another word. Signora Maria hugged her, sobbing. I don't want to lose you, Elena. Why can't you stay quiet? Because I can't pretend, Mama, Elena said, her voice breaking. I saw heaven. I can't live like it never happened. Luca, who'd been at the door, stepped in. I don't get all this, he said, his voice low. But if you believe it, I won't let Papa kick you out. He took her hand, a small gesture that told Elena she wasn't entirely alone. That night, as she lay in bed, the wind howled through the window. Her father's words cut like knives, but the flame in her heart didn't die. She knew this path would be hard, but the Virgin had promised to be with her, and she believed. After the confrontation with Signore Antonio, the air in the Rossi home grew heavy as a storm sky. Elena still slept in her small bed in the room she shared with Luca, but she no longer heard her father's tales of olive seasons or her mother's hymns in the kitchen. Signora Maria still cooked and prayed, but her eyes now held worry whenever they met Elena's. Signore Antonio avoided her, spending most of his time in the groves or the small workshop behind the house, fixing farming tools. Word of Elena spread fast in a town as small as San Martino. Whispers began by the stream in the bakery, and after Sunday Massachusetts, the Rossi girl says she met the Virgin, an old woman murmured, fingering her rosary. She's joined those strangers in Santa Lucia, another added, her tone suspicious. Father Giuseppe heard the rumors, and the next Sunday morning, he stood at the pulpit, his voice thundering. There are those spreading dangerous falsehoods, he declared, his sharp gaze sweeping the congregation. They claim we don't need the church or God's laws. But Scripture teaches that true faith is obedience. Beware of lies that lead to damnation. Elena sat in the back row with her mother and Luca, feeling each word like a needle in her heart. She knew he meant her, though he didn't name her. Signora Maria squeezed her hand tighter but said nothing. After Mass, some avoided her gaze, hurrying out, while others stared with curiosity mixed with scorn. Outside the church, Sophia waited under an old olive tree. You okay? She asked, her voice concerned. I heard the neighbors say you're crazy. Elena gave a sad smile. I'm not crazy, Sophia, but I don't know what to do. Papa's mad, Mama's worried, and the town thinks I'm a heretic. I just want to do what the Virgin asked, share grace. Sophia put a hand on her shoulder, her eyes fierce. Then do it. I see you've changed, you're stronger, calmer. If the Virgin chose you, you can't stay silent forever. Sophia's words were a cool breeze in the cold day. Elena nodded, though her heart remained heavy. She knew she had to move forward, but the cost might be losing her family and San Martino forever. That night, she knelt by her bed in the Santa Lucia house, gazing at the snow-dusted groves under the moon. Holy Mother, I'm scared, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I trust you. Give me courage. A week passed, and Elena could no longer keep the fire in her heart contained. It burned too fiercely, demanding to be shared, like wind urging olive blossoms to fall in spring. With Sophia and Signora Teresa's help from the Santa Lucia prayer group, she planned a small gathering by the San Martino stream. The water flowed gently over mossy stones, reflecting the golden sunset. It was a familiar spot, where children played, where mothers washed clothes, but today it became something more. Signora Teresa brought a few old wooden chairs, Sophia invited school friends, and Elena stood there, her small hands trembling as she clutched her thin Bible. About 20 people came, some from Santa Lucia, some curious San Martino locals, and even the quiet neighbor Teresa, who always smiled at Elena without saying much. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Elena took a deep breath, her small but clear voice rising above the stillness. I'm not good with words, she began, her eyes meeting the crowd's. But I have to tell you what happened to me. When I was sick, I nearly died. I left my body, saw a light, and the Virgin came to me. She told it all, the burning fever, heaven's endless flower fields, the cold hollow of regret, and the Virgin's message that Jesus' grace was a gift for everyone. She spoke of his love, his sacrifice on the cross, and how it changed her forever. I used to think I had to be perfect for God to love me, she said, tears rolling down her cheeks. But he loves me even when I don't deserve it. And he loves all of us that way. The crowd was silent, only the stream's murmur and the wind through the olive groves audible. Signora Teresa nodded, her eyes bright. Signore Marco, a man from Santa Lucia, stood. I thought I was unforgivable too, he said, his voice warm. Your story reminds me God doesn't give up on anyone. The quiet neighbor Teresa spoke up unexpectedly. I lost my son 5 years ago. I thought God was punishing me. But hearing you, I feel lighter. She wiped her tears, offering a frail smile, her thin hands clasped tightly. Not everyone was moved. Signore Franco, a San Martino farmer, stood and left, muttering, heresy. Father Giuseppe was right. A few others shook their heads and followed, their steps heavy on the snow. Elena watched them go, her heart aching, but she didn't stop. She remembered the Virgin's words. Not everyone will listen, but keep sowing. As the gathering ended, Sophia hugged her tightly. You did it, Elena. I'm proud of you. Signora Teresa whispered. You've planted seeds. God will do the rest. Word of the streamside gathering reached Father Giuseppe and Signore Antonio swiftly. The next morning, as Elena kneaded dough with Signora Teresa in the Santa Lucia house, a loud knock shook the door. Signore Antonio stormed in, his face flushed with anger, his hands clenched as if to crush something. Signora Teresa stepped aside, leaving space for father and daughter to face each other. What did you do by the stream last night? He demanded, his voice low like thunder over the groves. Elena stopped kneading, her hands trembling on the wooden table. I told them about seeing the Virgin, Papa. I wanted them to know about grace. Signore Antonio slammed his hand on the table, rattling the dough bowl. You dare defy the church in public? Father Giuseppe came this morning, saying you're tearing the community apart. Do you want our family cursed? Signora Teresa stepped forward, her voice soft. Signore Antonio, please calm down. Elena isn't against anyone. She just wants to share God's love. No, he roared, his eyes sharp as knives. She chose this path, she bears the consequences. If you don't apologize to Father Giuseppe and stop, you're no daughter of mine. Elena stood still, tears streaming down. She looked at her father, the man who'd held her when she fell in the groves, taught her to pick olives with his rough hands. I can't apologize for the truth, Papa, she whispered. I love you, but I have to do what the Virgin asked. Signore Antonio turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Signora Teresa hugged Elena, whispering, God will guide you, Elena. Don't fear. That afternoon, Father Giuseppe came to Santa Lucia, demanding Elena retract her words before San Martino's congregation. He stood before her, the cross on his neck glinting in the weak sunlight. You're young, Elena, he said sternly. Repent, and God will forgive you. Elena took a deep breath, her heart pounding. I can't, Father. I saw the Virgin, and she told me to speak the truth. Father Giuseppe shook his head, his face darkening. Then you're no longer welcome in San Martino's church. He left, leaving her with the distant church bells, a sound now like a cold farewell. Winter lingered in San Martino, and Elena had no place in the Rossi home. Signore Antonio kept his word, demanding she leave if she wouldn't renounce her lies. Signora Maria wept and pleaded, but he wouldn't budge. Luca offered her his room, but Elena knew it would only worsen things. She packed a few clothes, her small Bible, and left on a morning of thick snow. Sophia and Signora Teresa welcomed her in Santa Lucia, letting her stay in the group's small stone house. This is your home as long as you need, Signora Teresa said, resting a hand on her shoulder. Elena nodded, but her heart felt empty. She missed her mother's bread, Luca's guitar, even her father's stern voice. Now, she had only the flame in her heart and her new friends in Santa Lucia. In the days that followed, Elena lived quietly, helping Signora Teresa bake, reading her Bible, and praying by the window overlooking the groves. She no longer heard San Martino's church bells, but the wind through the olive trees became her new hymn. One evening, Sophia brought news from home. Your mama cries a lot, Elena. Luca says don't give up. Elena nodded, tears falling. I won't, Sophia. But I miss them. Signora Teresa sat beside her, her voice gentle. God doesn't promise an easy road, but he promises to be with you. Be patient. Your family will understand in time. Elena wasn't sure that was true, but she trusted the Virgin. She looked out at the snow-covered groves, seeing her footprints from San Martino to here. A path she hadn't chosen, but one she had to walk. Spring finally came to San Martino, bringing gentle rains and green shoots to the olive groves. Elena didn't return to the Rossi house, but she found a new home in Santa Lucia. Not the stone house, but the community of those who heard her story. She didn't build a new church or replace Father Giuseppe. She created a space where people could find grace, healing wounds left by fear. One afternoon, as Elena fixed chairs in the small house, Signore Antonio appeared. He stood at the threshold, holding his old toolbox, his weathered face softer. "I don't understand everything you say," he began, his voice hesitant, "but I see you in these people's eyes. I want to listen if you'll still have me." Elena smiled, tears welling up. "I've always wanted you here, Papa." She ran to hug him, feeling like she was embracing San Martino again. Signora Maria arrived soon after, carrying a basket of bread and a tight hug. "I don't know if you're right or wrong," she whispered, "but I see you're happy. That's enough." Luca remained wary, but he began asking questions instead of staying silent, a small sign of change. San Martino didn't transform entirely. Father Giuseppe still preached judgment, and many still shunned Elena. But new footprints appeared on the path, those of people finding freedom and grace. Sophia started a small class for orphans, using her savings to buy books. Signora Teresa wrote a notebook of her faith journey, sending it to nearby villages. One night, Elena stood outside the house, gazing at the starry sky. She recalled the light in the darkness, the Virgin's voice. "I'll be with you." She wasn't perfect. Some days she doubted, some days she tired. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She'd found the truth, and it set her free. Elena whispered into the night, "Thank you." Under the vast sky, the light in her heart burned on.